part of what I'm going to talk about today is response to a request from a new journal, something called the Journal of Management Scientific Reports, that's starting now. It's a spinoff from the Journal of Management, and it's trying to think about how should we write just empirical reports, so that everything in there has to be previously hypothesized. So it's really about theory testing. So after the session, I will post an essay that I've written for them. Try to post it on SSON, and we can send links out. And I'd love to get feedback because it's not done. So love to get your comments. So I have redesigned this presentation a few times. And last night I decided that I was burying the lead. And so if I followed my own advice, which was to consider the reader, I would turn the presentation around. So I'm going to do that. And I'm also going to tell you at the beginning what my summary is. And here it is. We all go to get our PhDs and so forth because we want to advance science and we want to conduct empirical research to increase our own understanding. But most of what we know, we have learned from reading others' research. Readers are really what is critical to the advancement of knowledge. At present, we can often not distinguish what is knowledge and what is hokum. I know that Ebrat is a fan of a book by Frankfurter called On Bullshit. So we can't tell what is knowledge and what is, as Frankfurter would call it, bullshit. And if we are going to advance, and this is the purpose of this journal that I've been working with, our state of knowledge, we have to figure out how we report so that we can advance our collective understanding through reading. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to argue, and we're going to go through this in three modes. First of all, just talk about this importance of readers and reading. Then I decided last night I would, rather than start from the generalities and talk about Bayesian inference and testimony and frequentist statistics, I'd give some cases, and then we come back to thinking about how we can improve reporting and how we can think about the reader when we're reporting. So I'm going to start with specifics and then go to the generalities. In all of this, please interrupt at any time. Raise your hand. I've asked Ebrat to look at the chat if something comes in, because I won't be able to monitor it. Because, as I said, this is something I've been struggling with for a while, and I keep discovering things I should have recognized. Sort of amazing to me in some ways that these ideas are coming to me, later in my career. So please interrupt anytime. Okay, so most of what we know, we've learned from others. We learned in high school, we learned in college, we learned as PhD students. In order to advance knowledge, we got to learn from each other. We have to stand on the shoulders of giants, in the famous expression. But we don't know whether others' reports are trustworthy. And Ebrat invited me, I think, because I published an article in the Academy of Management Review a few years ago on learning from testimony. And it's a real question about, are we justified in learning from others' reports when we don't know that they're truthful? So are we justified in claiming that we know something? And I struggled with that in that paper. So how can we learn? What can we do? And that's what I'm going to try to discuss today. But rather than go into the epistemology of that, I'm going to give you a couple of case examples. And here's the first one. In my real background, for those of you who don't know me, I've done a lot of work on business and the environment. And right now, the role of private business and leveraging the private sector, as people say, is extremely topical, important. It's getting a lot of attention and so forth. The research on that goes back many years. And so you see here an article by Waddick and Graves in 1997, and a series of articles that then followed that used the same data, basically the same data sets, the data expanded over time, and came up with different answers. So Waddick and Graves claimed there was a positive relationship between corporate social responsibility and financial performance. Then McWilliams and Siegel came along and said, nope, there's no effect. Then Hillman Klein said, well, it's sometimes positive and sometimes negative. Then Hull and Rothenberg said, no, it's only for certain kinds of firms in certain kinds of industries. Then Barnett and Solomon came along and said, nope, it's actually U-shaped. And then Zhao and Merrill came along and said, well, it's only true for one of the dependent variables. And each of these is cited, particularly the older ones, an astonishing number of times. And they're still cited as definitive. 7,000 Google sites, which is in 2019, it's probably 10,000 by now, is like a third of all my sites, one paper. So this is an incredibly impactful study. So, well, what can we learn from that? How do we know, right? How do we know what we can find out here? And the problem is that each of those studies, you may have all heard this idea of a garden of forking paths. Each of those studies is based on a lot of assumptions. Anytime you do any research, you make decisions. How should I match this data set and that data set? Is that a good match? Is that not a good match? Does this variable really mean that variable? On and on and on and on. So you start with a set of assumptions, and you then observe some outcome from that. And you turn to the world and you say, I, Hansel, estimate that there's a positive relationship. So I refute the null hypothesis that CSR is not associated with financial returns. Look how weird that statement is. We do this extreme, strange backflip when we're doing frequentist analysis. Then usually at the end of your report, you say, well, I found support for my hypothesis that CSR is associated with financial returns. So now you've changed actually the kind of statement you're making from a frequentist one to more of a belief type one. Then people come along and they make it even stronger. Hansel found evidence that CSR is associated with profits. Hansel found evidence that CSR is profitable, gets cited. We all cite that, right? Tatiana, 2022, found this, and then we cite that, goes off to be truth. Then pretty soon it becomes a movement. CSR is profitable, CSR is profitable. Men in beards, CSR is profitable, demonstrating this until some point in the future, some next person comes along and uses slightly different empirical assumptions and says, I'm not getting the same result. What do I do? Trash or publish? That's the problem. And so you get those 6 papers, each with different results, because they've gone through this empirical garden differently. Should I pause here? Going once, going twice. Okay, I'm going to continue on. So there are the 6 studies again. So what my colleague Luca Berchicci and I decided to do was to take all the assumptions in those 6 studies, all of the different choices they made, and run all the models implied not only by each path, but by all the paths. So those studies use different outcome variables, return on assets, market to book. Each of them scaled their measures differently. They used different assumptions about functional forms. They made different guesses about which kind of variance would be important. They used different kinds of controls. They used different kinds of lags. They used different, et cetera, et cetera. So we ran every possible combination of those, market to book, the McWilliams and Siegel measurement, the quadratic form between firms, time, fixed effects. And we've now, this chart, which I'll stand for a moment, is a graph of all of the coefficients we got from the full garden. This is like you walk through the garden in every possible way. And on the left, we've sorted it by coefficient estimate. This is the relationship between corporate social responsibility and financial performance. from highest and most positive to negative. And the gray is the confidence interval. It really should be slightly different than that, but you can think about that as your confidence interval if you ran the study in a frequentist way. And the red bars are the models that we ran that corresponded with the 6 studies that I'm talking about. You can see we do deliver some positive results and we do deliver some negative results. But what's interesting about this is the full range of estimates you can get based on these different assumptions is huge. And most of the time when we report our research, we report a snapshot of a very big picture of all the ways we could have done the analysis. So Luca and I then just checked some of the different assumptions that you could make. And what we found was the assumption about where the variance, which kind of variance was important, was the most, that really distinguished the results. So if you compared firms, this is between firm analysis, you got always a positive coefficient. And oftentimes those coefficients would be significant if you run it that way. When you compared within firm, that is, does a change in corporate social responsibility affect financial performance next year, you got a negative relationship. Sometimes a positive one, never a positive and significant one, often negative and significant. And all of the studies, when viewed this way, started making sense. Oh, I should tell you, this is we further grouped this by, this is the Barnett and Solomon way of measuring corporate social responsibility, the Hillman and Klein, the Hall and Rothenberg, McWilliams and Siegel, Wack and Graves. So those are the different ways they've each measured the thing. It doesn't matter. They were very proud, each of these original authors, about their scales. Their scales don't really seem to matter. What matters is, am I comparing across firms or I'm comparing within firms? And if you only look at a snapshot, you often can't tell what's really causing your particular result, what assumption. When you look at all the assumptions together, you can see it. Is this making any sense out there? And I've such a strange thing to give these talks on Zoom. You can't get any feedback. Are we good? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So we synthesize this. All right, when we look at all of them, we can now say across firms, social performance is positively correlated with financial performance. However, high social performance seldom precedes financial return. And after that, we fell down the rabbit hole. So that's Luca, who's tall and stylish because he's Italian, and so therefore he's wearing groovy glasses. And my increasingly widening self, we're falling down the rabbit hole there. And what happened was a bunch of people said, well, you did those 6 studies, you should do this other study. And the study was by Kahn, Serafine, and Yoon. And this study, it does things a little differently. It decides that it's going to use an additional data set on materiality. That is, which of these measures, a prediction about which of these measures will be related to financial performance. And they do a test using these SASB data, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board data. And what they find is that if you create a new scale, scaling now by which elements of corporate social responsibility are thought to be material, you can get 3 to 6% additional return from 1991 to 2013. That's not 3 to 6% multiplied by the current return. That is, if your current return is 6% now, you can get 9 to 12. So that is huge. And of course, it became an incredibly important paper. It's cited, it's all over websites. It's used by the Security and Exchange Commission. It's used by NGOs like Ceres. It was used in testimony before the Senate. But again, they make all kinds of assumptions. And I'm not going to go through these, but they walk through that garden of forking paths in a particular way. And Luca and I decided we would run it in all the other ways that you could run the analysis. And here's what we found. What you see is, again, all the coefficients we could get sorted from highest to lowest with a confidence interval. And the dashed red line, which we can reproduce, is their report. And that report, their estimate is bigger than 98% of all the other estimates you can get just by matching the data differently or making different assumptions that when SASB says this, it means that, or different functional forms or any of that same kinds of stuff. And what you will see again is that the uncertainty about how to model the study is much bigger than what we usually report as uncertainty when we do our tables of statistics, where we talk about sample uncertainty, our 95% confidence interval. We then went on to say, well, we think that their result is an artifact. It's an outlier compared with the rest of the other ways of doing things. It's not robust to more conservative estimates. If you construct the variable in different ways, if you use continuous rather than binary forms, if you don't orthogonalize, their measure doesn't occur. If you allow industries to have separate trends, you don't get their result. And it lacks face validity. Their measure, for strange reasons, decided that most of the firms in extractive industries, that's oil, cement, coal, were highly sustainable in the mid-2000s. So again, it doesn't make sense. And the result was, we thought we would publish this as a replication and we'd have a big effect. What we discovered is a real reticence. So we eventually got it published, but we sent it to two journals first, and we were told things like accountants don't like people to replicate studies, or their model is the right one. So of all these models up here, that dashed line is the only one you should consider. Or on converse, through the back channel, a bunch of people began to send me private emails saying, there are many other studies on ESG, I should call them corporate social responsibility here, that are wrong. Here's another. So, can we learn? That paper that I just described is still influencing policy. How are we going to advance knowledge when we currently get reports that are snapshots based on a particular and narrow set of empirical choices that the researcher made? Now I'm going to force you to interact with me because I'm getting lonely.
Andy, can I ask a clarifying question, please?
Sure.
The graph you showed earlier with the epistemic uncertainty, could you explain a little bit more, what you mean by sample uncertainty and what you mean by epistemic uncertainty?
Sure. When we do this is the part of the study this is part of the presentation I rejected last night. But when we do frequentist analysis, we are predicting the probability of data in future events when a treatment is repeated exactly and it's evaluated in exactly the same way. And I know that sounds like a lot, but when you write something like a standard error, we report a coefficient and a standard error. That standard error is only about what happens if I just keep drawing samples from the same population. It's just about the fact that the samples are going to vary each time. The model, that is, what do I think the treatment is? How have I specified my statistics? How have I matched my data? All the things, the recipe to go from data to analysis, that's your model in your frequentist world. That's held fixed. So that's conditional on the use of that exact process. What would happen from an uncertainty point of view just from changing the sample? The problem is, most of the time, I'm sure there are many empirical researchers on this call who've, messed around with data and tried to figure out, well, how should I think about this? That's an outlier. Should I throw out that outlier? Should I log this variable? Should I normalize it? Should I, a whole bunch of choices that you're making. That's in the recipe. And so the epistemic uncertainty is, well, we're not really exactly sure what's the right way to create the recipe. And so, we're going to get different answers depending on that. Another way to say that is, imagine you took 448 scholars and they had to make choices about all these different parts of walking through this empirical process. They would end up with different results based on the fact that they used a slightly different recipe to go from data to coefficient. This is critical. And it's weird because I had never thought about epistemic uncertainty in a deep way until 5 years ago. And yet it usually dominates what we think the uncertainty is we have when we report a coefficient. Does anyone, please, somebody else ask me a clarifying question.
No, thank you, Andy. Just checking if anybody else has any other questions so far based on this presentation.
I guess
This is Anna Keller.
Thank you,
Hi.
Anna.
Please go ahead.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for sharing your work with us. Am I to understand that the sample uncertainty and the epistemological uncertainty is a result of them each study using different constructs to measure what CSR is?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably easier to see here. So supposing you start, and I'm going to get to this in a little while. Supposing you're writing a research report. And almost always we're told to write a research report like an hourglass. Or you've probably heard that expression. You start broad, and so your theory is corporate social responsibility is linked to financial performance. But your first question is, well, what's financial performance? Is it accounting, return on assets, or is it market to book? And there are big differences in sort of theory about what you're evaluating there, because return on assets can be, because it's accounting data, it can be biased and it can be strategically manipulated, and market to book implies information getting to the market. I mean, it's all, so you're making a guess. Then most CSR variables are based on about, well, at least this data set, I don't know, 150 elements, right? All these different things. So how do I make a scale? Is it all there exactly the same? Or should I weight them? Or should I say that, well, this one isn't a topic with 15 and I don't want to weigh it differently than this one over here than 5, so I'm going to weigh it by topic. So you make some guesses. You're guessing, right? It's like baking a cake, but you're not exactly sure what the measurements should be. So you're guessing how much sugar, how much whatever. Then you're guessing about functional form. Is this well, we have a theory that CSR is related to financial performance, but is it linear? Or maybe it's moderated by something? Or maybe it's curvilinear? Maybe it's binary, who knows? You're guessing. Then you're thinking, well, how should this show up? Should this show up as the differences in firms? Like this is like an outcome, eventually this causes this kind of change in state of the firms, or should I see this changing over time, like a change one year, then is associated with change next year? And then of course you're thinking, oh man, there are all these other confounds out there. There's maybe it's unobserved things about the firm, maybe it's the size of the firm, maybe it's industry dependent, maybe it changes by period. It was different in the 90s than it was in the thousands. Maybe I need to control for things with putting a lag dependent variable in. All those are choices that you make. That's your recipe. And there's a zillion, whatever it is, 1,000 or more recipes that you can form just with those things. So that's your model. And any one of those, when you run it, you get a coefficient and a standard error. But that standard error is just about the future sampling if you run it exactly the same way. But the next author comes along and they run it a little differently, they get a totally different answer because they mixed it a little differently. The first the coefficient of standard error, that's the sampling. It's also called the aleatoric uncertainty. This not knowing exactly how we should model the world, which is sometimes called modeling the data generation process, that's the epistemic uncertainty. Like, what is the right way to think about this, model this? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Other thoughts?
Hi, my name is Julia. Sorry, I've got no camera for today, but I still want to ask something. So isn't this like the story with the mice and the elephant? So we always just see a little bit of something and someone else sees something different. And this is how this whole graph is showing all the bits and bytes of the modeling that people are doing and seeing different pieces of the elephant. And there is no truth, like Papa already said. There are theories and we just can improve on these little bits until we see the whole picture better and see some, I don't know, causalities. So you never can be sure that the things other people are true in that sense. That's fundamental for science, or not? So
I don't know the story of the mice and the elephant, so I feel somewhat handicapped.
So I can try to tell it. I'm not sure if my English is very good, but there is a place where a lot of mice live and they are all blind. And one day there comes an elephant into the mice, and the mice are going to the elephant and they are touching little bits of the elephant. And then afterwards they're talking to each other like, the elephant is like a long rope because he touched the rustle, and the other ones know he's like a fan because they touched the ear of the elephant, and so on. And so I think it's kind of the same thing. We are looking at one little bit and arguing with each other about the truth, but we just can't see the whole picture.
I'm not. I think there's something connected about that, but you could actually argue that the problem with the mice is they don't understand about random elephant sampling, and the problem is that they sampled predominantly on the leg or the tail or something. But if they had randomly run around on the elephant, they all would have come up with the same observation. Because what you're telling me is one of them went to the tail, so they sampled on the tail. One of them went to the leg, they sampled on the leg. One went.
Yes.
So even if they, I'm not sure it quite works. But I think you're on to this even more fundamental problem, which is, and this is what I skipped. All right, I'm going to go in. I'm going in. Okay. This is what happened to me. This is the origin of my project today. The people at Journal of Management Scientific Reports came to me and said, could you write us something about how tests should be done? Because this is a paper at the Journal on Theory Testing. And I very arrogantly said, yes, of course, I will show the world how testing is done. I will write the ultimate claim on how this really worked. And then I thought to myself, wait, how do we do theory testing? And this is the problem a little bit that you're describing. Like, how should mice evaluate the elephant? And the problem that we have is that induction, that is going from data to conclusion, is always uncertain because it requires assumptions. And the mice may be making assumptions that whatever part of the body they're on, it's representative. If those mice were doing some kind of more philosophical, analysis of the elephant, they might be modeling it differently. And this problem of induction drives us to do the research in the kind of way we do. There are two ways of solving this problem. One is with frequentist analysis, and the other one is with Bayesian analysis, and then Popper, which is about falsification. But this drives us to do a lot of the crazy things we do. So we're often struggling with this problem of being uncertain because we've made assumptions. And back here, we've either made assumptions about the way we model things, and so therefore we're not sure whether those assumptions are right, or we're not sure whether samples that we have now will be the same as samples in the future. But what I'm trying to argue is often it's our way of modeling something that's more uncertain than the usual thing that we worry about, which is the sample. Did that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Andy, I've got a question for you. It's John Eckhart.
Oh, hi, John.
And just, when I look at this, and let's say we just changed what the question was to some aspect of flying an airplane that would cause it to fall out of the sky. And when I look at this picture here that you still have on the screen, which is great, basically, if somebody worked with a model where they decide that the conclusion was the red dots, plane's going to crash, unpredictably to this person. And so I'm kind of asking you, people that build airplanes, how do they tackle this problem? Because for them, it's different for us. For them, the plane can't fall out of the sky. And maybe there's some insight there for us and as what we should do. Do they do this picture that you're showing us, which is fantastic? I love this every time we show it. Or why don't airplanes fly out of the sky?
Well, they do a lot of extreme testing of things, but the question then also becomes, and you probably know this, John, is how extreme, right? So you have a theory about what things are going to face, and so you're testing things only within that theory that you have. And we know there are two cases where that really didn't work. One was the Challenger disaster, and that because they believed that it would never be that cold in Florida to make the O-rings hard and then cause leaking. So they didn't really worry about that case. And in fact, they didn't have data. They hadn't run this analysis because they never considered it really. Now, you're going to tell me that some of them did have the analysis and it wasn't allowed to be communicated, but you see where I'm going with this. The other one is the 2008 crisis. People had run all kinds of models about what could happen if real estate began to go south. But they had assumed that the correlation in drops in real estate prices would not be highly correlated across different regions of the United States. So they didn't have that case in the analysis that they've done. And we suffered. One case we killed people, in the other case. So thinking about how uncertain am I? And I imagine I'm talking, every time you run a paper, it's a moral struggle because you're making these decisions and you're thinking, I don't know, is that the right one? Is that the right one? I don't know, I think that's right. You're guessing. And unfortunately, then when we present it as if it's true. This is the right way to model it. This is the right way to do the estimation.
Yeah,
does that make sense? Yes.
Does it mean that some of this thing has to do with the context?
Context, yes, it does.
So if the context changes, then means that the knowledge is invalid.
Okay, so I maybe misunderstood. So when
you said it has to do that the epistemic uncertainty has to do with the context. And I'm saying that means that if the context changes, then the knowledge or their findings is invalid.
So yeah. The problem is I'm going to come back to you in a second. One problem with writing about this stuff is there's deep uncertainties and knowledge and theories that slide off in every direction. So, there are questions about like, what is knowledge? And what does it mean for something to be in a different context? So I'm going to try to do the best I can to answer your question.
Okay.
But I'm not as much of a philosopher as I'd like. So when we do frequent statistics, that is the usual stuff we do with p-values and standard errors and confidence intervals and those kinds of things. We are saying, we are estimating these where the population does not change. So the context does not change. The thing we're sampling on is always the same. We're going to give the drug to these people randomly from this population, and we're going to see what happens. And then we're going to go give it to a new random sample, but the same population of people. Context does not change. The problem with knowledge that comes from that is that it's often based on that assumption, right? So one thing, it's based on two assumptions. One is about the way we sample from that population. That's where the sampling uncertainty comes from.
Okay.
And then maybe we don't really know what the population is. Maybe it turns out that this drug will work differently on people with a particular kind of a genetic makeup or something like that. And we didn't realize that it was going to be different. And again, that's part of our model, right? Our model is this is the population. But if that turns out to be wrong, that goes into this epistemic uncertainty. What is the population we're sampling from? Did that help?
Yeah, that helped. But even that even look is still part of the context. Because it's
part of the
not
context.
taking into account the
Yeah.
genetic
Okay.
population.
Yeah. So when
So
using
it's
your
still
language,
a context.
using your language, sampling uncertainty is the uncertainty we have within this context. The epistemic uncertainty is, well, what is the context in which we're studying this? How big is, what are the parameters? I think. Okay, so I'm asking you guys, now that I've argued that every time we see a paper, it's a snapshot. It's either a mouse running on an elephant is one of the examples we've gotten, or it's conditional on the context, which I think is a little bit the same. Oheen, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right. Or it's highly dependent on the way you've done your statistical modeling, your recipe. Well, then what can we learn from anything we read?
Well, it's a little worse than that because of publication bias, right?
Yeah, so John is bringing in another problem, which is that it's worse than that because what's going to get published are the things that are going to seem to be surprising, but the things that are seemingly surprising are usually the ones that are wrong. So how can we learn? So this is what I've been trying to figure out. Like, what do we need to learn from published reports? How are we going to make this work? What kind of reporting would help? Okay. I'm 50 minutes. Am I boring the heck out of people? Are you guys okay? Because I'm now going to go to some solutions. I can't see anyone. All right. So I argue that what we need to do as authors is to think a lot more about our readers. And the first question is, what do they want to know? And sometimes readers want to know, and maybe our research can answer, excuse me, what would happen if something was repeated? What is the future data going to look like if something's repeated? So if we run this psychological experiment, if we run this training program, if we, we change we add different kinds of incentives to managers, so they're thinking of social responsibility. What would happen to the data in the future? We may not be concerned so much about exactly how it works or the explanation of how it works. We just want to know if we hit the system with this, what happens in the future? And that's what we get using most of the statistics we evaluate now. The other thing we may want to get is, well, what's the right explanation for this data? So most of the time in strategy and management, we study stuff that'll never be repeated again, right? It's a one-time event. You know, what happened in the, what happened when this company was faced with this new kind of technology? What happened when, God, I can't believe I'm struggling with this, but most of the things I studied the Responsible Care Program, which was a collective group of chemical companies getting together. What happened? Well, that'll never be repeated. So then you're looking for explanations of the thing, not what will happen if it's repeated in the future. Those are two different kinds of knowledge. And one of them is sometimes called a frequency type knowledge, and the second one's called a belief type knowledge. And we can talk more about that. I decided to diminish that because I think more important it is, how certain is it, or is the right way to model the data, which is what we've been talking about. If it's certain, we can kind of run one analysis. If it's uncertain, we may have to run many models. And I, of course, as a management professor, have a 2x2. And here it is. If you, sometimes we're looking for the probable effects of treatment. What would data look like in the future if something was repeated? Sometimes we're looking for the probable explanation of the effects. So this is what happened after responsible care. Why? Sometimes we are pretty clear about how to model it. Sometimes we're not at all clear. So laboratory experiments, those of you who are psychologists running lab experiments, you're in the best of all possible worlds, because you can perfectly control the treatment. You can avoid everything that could be non-random by randomizing. And generally, you're pretty clear about how to model the thing. This was the state of the person before, we gave them the treatment, this is what happened afterwards. Or we compare this patient to that patient. When you do archival studies, it gets much harder. Because, you know, supposing you want to go back and look at what happened with employee treatment programs, well, you're not exactly sure what happened, how to think about that. You're probably going to have a lot of modeling choices. But you still may be interested in not so much the theory, but just what happens. You know, medicine is in quadrant 1. If we give this person this shot, do they get better? It's not really concerned about what in the shot does it. I mean, yes, we're concerned about that, but mostly we just want to know what's the effect. And then sometimes we're interested in knowing the explanation of the effect. And again, we have high and low modeling uncertainty. Our problem right now is that we report the same way in all of these conditions. And we report this way. This is the way mostly we report. It's something called the hourglass. And the idea goes like this. And we already talked about it a little bit. You have a very high level theory, and then you narrow it down. So you start off with TSRs related to financial performance. Then you have a hypothesis, which is a scale of KLD measures will be linked to return on assets. Then you operationalize that. Then you go to a sample. Then you go do some analysis, and you get to this point, and you report one graph or two, one table or two. Then from that, you begin to go from claims, which are fairly narrow, to what this guy who originated this idea, or one of the early sponsors of it, to grand claims about knowledge. So you get in the middle, you're saying, you know, table 1, the men and father watching condition cried significantly more. And by the end, you're making these grand statements like, not since Darwin's first observations of psychology treated that as much. These are from him. If emotions can incarcerate us by hiding our complicity, at least their expression can liberate us from displaying our authenticity, which I'm not even sure I know what it means. So this style makes sense if you can neck everything down to a point. But a lot of the time we can't. A lot of the time, we're really not sure exactly what this point should be. And so when we do that, I think we've got a report in a very different way, where we look at lots and lots of different models here, and then we analyze those in a different way as well. So I think what we need to start doing as scholars is changing away from this standardized reporting that we use now to a new style of reporting, which I'm advocating, called the VAS. And just to, I'm going to see if it's in here. Did I keep that? Yeah, maybe this will also help. Imagine that as a research, you can envision a large number of models that you could run. And usually now we report a dot. And imagine that your readers can envision a large number of models that can be run. And there's their centroid. Right now, they get the dot, but they can't necessarily see what everything else looks like, so they don't know how to understand it. So what I'm arguing is we need to expand the middle of the research we do. We have to run many, many more models. We have to evaluate those models differently. And we have to accept and admit to some of this epistemic uncertainty that we face. So readers are critical to the advancement of knowledge. At present, readers often cannot distinguish knowledge from hokum or just honest error on the other party. And we've got to start considering the reader. We've got to start thinking about their goals and their uncertainties. What kind of knowledge do they want? And how uncertain are they about how this thing should be modeled and evaluated, and adjust our reports accordingly. And now I'm happy to have a conversation or answer any questions or discuss epistemology in any way. I feel like I've driven away a few of you already, but happy to continue the conversation. Ravi.
I think we have the first hand, Ravi.
Hi, thank you, Andy. Thank you so much for this. This is, I mean, it's a great discussion on how we think about knowledge and how we construct knowledge. My question is, when we think about the readers for, especially in these journal articles, we're thinking about other folks who are also like us and have maybe the same motivations. We're trying to publish, get through that gate, get to that tenure, get to the next piece. So is that where we should really focus? I think when you're talking about, I'm thinking, okay, so we need maybe more Bayesian statistics so that we're not doing just null hypothesis. Maybe we need more expanded editorial or journal policies that encourage and allow for this kind of review. But as speaking personally, as an author, I'm going to be hesitant to offer this knowing that it might be rejected because I'm tenure track and my first goal is get published. Could you speak to the dichotomy?
Well, I think you brought up two dichotomies. One is the audience. And I know Mike Toffel came and talked to this group and talked about how to reach out to the broader world. And I'm not going to talk about that. That is an interesting topic. So I'm thinking about scholars. And you're bringing up this issue of careers, and you're introducing up the problem of the social construction of knowledge. And you're absolutely right. I think right now it's not safe. I'm sorry, guys. Right now you have to report pretty much the way that may even be false, which is you're going to kind of claim that you have the best and only way to model your data. You're going to give one table and a couple graphs, and you're going to be certain, and you're going to make grand claims at the end as advised by DJ Ben. But I think it's going to change. And this journal that I'm working with, this Journal of Management Scientific Reports, they've decided that one of the problems we have is that people hark, right? This is related to what we're talking about today, which is you look at the data and then you form the hypotheses. And as soon as you've done that, all your claims are busted. And so they've got a policy which is you're only going to be able to do research where the theory has already been advanced. Now, it doesn't solve the problem, but they're also saying, and we're going to publish studies that compare across theories. And they've said, we're going to publish lots of replications. And I think anytime you look at a replication or you look at a comparison across theories, you're going to have to run lots of different comparisons. Because otherwise, and we know this, people will just say, well, your replication's wrong. Yeah, if you probably all out there know the story of Amy Cuddy and power poses. And she claimed that if you took a expansive posture, your hormones changed and you did better. And just like I described earlier, someone replicated and got a different answer. And someone replicated and got the same answer. And someone replicated. Finally, somebody replicated it using lots and lots of assumptions and said, no, you know what? You can pretty much get any answer that you want. And that is the problem, is you're kind of filtering through the data and getting answers that you want. So I think my answer to you right now is in the mainstream journals, although I've published in SMJ and Brent's published in SMJ and we're making progress. Standard styles are probably going to still be preferred, but I think it's going to change. Was that coherent? Other hands?
Does it have to do with the situation where other people try to manipulate the data?
I can't see who's speaking.
This
could
means
you-
maybe I'm trying to ask a question. You were talking
Sure.
about the falsification of the decision, and I'm saying that does it have to do with a situation where people try to manipulate the data to suit the situation?
It can, I have to say, when people look at this graph that I showed earlier, many people immediately say, oh, they fished it, right? They looked through 500 models and they picked the one that got the answer that they liked, and they reported that one. And let's be clear, we live in the steroids era of social science, and I have done that. I have looked through more models than I should have, and then reported the one that I liked the answer to, which was cheating. We don't know that they did this. We only know that they got that result. And as John Eckhart brought up earlier, it might be because many papers had been submitted to the journal, but the journal didn't like the ones that said we don't really find anything. They liked the one that they got a nice, strong, positive result, and that's the one that got published. So I don't know where the distortion comes. All I know is we can't really tell anything unless we see this full distribution of the way it's reasonable to do this analysis and not just the one snapshot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Ohene.
No, I'm the new person with their hand up. Was Agnieszka.
Yeah, but Agnes is definitely easier, I guess. Hello,
Okay.
everyone. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for sharing with us your amazing presentation. I think for me personally, sometimes difficult because statistics is not so easy for everyone. And you are you have huge experiences with research. So if it's possible, I would like to ask you to share with us some good practice and some suggestions. I mean, exactly how to create good research model, because I guess a lot of us, we will create research model now or in the future, of course, based on the literature review. And I see different approaches. I mean, for example, on the one hand, in the model, we should have, for example, 3 constructs and only 3 variables. But on the other hand, we have different approach. No, we should have more complex approach. We should have 6 constructs in the model and 6 variables. So I see that we have many votes, many voices in this conversation. Do you have some suggestions for us in this topic?
Yeah, so So the nuts and bolts of this, I think are really a good thing. This is not a bad page. It's my colleague Tim Simcoe, and it's his page on empirical etiquette. And I think, Tim is also my co-author on the MR paper and so forth. I think this is pretty good advice. And he's talking about exactly that kind of thing. Do we show the complicated model? Do we show the simple model? How do we do it? How do we think about the reporting of our data? And he has, for some of the more advanced things that people do, he's got some advice about what you do. So I think this is a very good website to turn to.
Okay, thank you.
There's also something that you can always do, which is that you can admit, if you're writing a paper where you are not fully clear of your theory in advance, and you haven't pre-specified everything in advance, increasingly at journals, you can turn the paper around. You can report the analysis that you did, and then you can hypothesize. Now, you have to be very careful with what you say about what the meaning is. You can no longer say, I showed, I proved it. You can say, our best explanation for our data is this. It's got to be personal. My best interpretation. I find it reasonable too. And I don't think that's a terrible way to go. And if you think about a lot of best statisticians say that's what we should do. So that's a different way to go. But I think it's very contingent. Happy to talk to you about it offline. Tim Simcoe's site's a good one.
Thank
Please
you,
send it.
Ellen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ellen.
Joy.
Yes, thank you. I guess my comment, it's a comment, more of a reflection. First of all, thank you for this really excellent exercise in thinking about what we're doing. It seems to me that at the core, your argument is similar to what qualitative researchers have been saying for several decades now. That we really can't know exactly what truth with a capital T is. And we have to acknowledge all these assumptions. And if you take, and so I'm going to pause there. So I just have been and still am in a really interesting argument with a new set of human subjects, IRB people at my university. And they are really leaning on the federal definition of what is research, and especially leaning on the generalizability piece. And saying that a lot of the research that our students are doing is not generalizable, so it's not research. So it's just interesting to me in a reflective sort of mode to counterbalance the fact, that historically quantitative research has been the gold standard, right? And yet you've pointed out a great many sort of fallacies or things that are behind the scenes. Anyway, it's just a reflection, but you may have a comment.
Yeah, so I have a comment. So first of all, qualitative research is desperately needed. How do we come up with theories about what we're going to test? We come up with them by observing the data and then hypothesizing. Inevitably, that is a process called abduction, not induction, abduction or inference to the best explanation. And when we do that, we can only say, hey, this is what I think. We can't conclude, but we can then say something that seems reasonable or maybe even fits a bunch of sort of empirical virtues, which is what IB is all about. And then if we're going to be more certain about it, then we probably have to do some kind of test. So it's absurd to say that qualitative research is not important, in my view. The second thing is quantitative researchers have increasingly recognized that they're often doing abduction. That is, they're looking at their data first, and then they're making claims about it, theories about it, which I just advised one of the ACME to do. And even James Heckman, James Heckman won the Nobel Prize for his work on statistics on the sample selection methods. And he has written a paper, which you can hand to your IRB, called Abducting Economics. And basically he argues almost all the time we're going out there, we're looking at the data, we're coming up with explanations, and that's what we have to do. Now, what the journal I'm working with is saying is, okay, once we've done that, then we should test it by having hypotheses ahead of time and specifying the model ahead of time, and so forth. But it's absurd that we don't recognize that this process of discovering from the data is a critical part of science.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Andy, thank you for the talk. We met online for several times. We didn't have a chance to talk in person, but I greatly appreciate the talk. Very inspiring. So, like, I'll be thinking about how to connect, your talk, your research to the broader picture, to RBM. At the end of the day, research is imperfect for sure. It was imperfect before, or in the future. So the key question probably is how to make the imperfections in our imperfect world a little bit better. So at the end, I feel like there are probably two issues: is credibility, as you mentioned, epistemology. Secondly, probably is usefulness. For example, like CSR, like firm performance, initially was an important question. I mean, found some correlation. But regarding correlation, I mean, it's important. People didn't have a very clear understanding about the mechanism, why the CSR performance is related. And then we have like different kind of empirical findings. But maybe it's a time we move on from that question, because we know, at some time is there a correlation, sometimes there are no correlation. There may be some reason for that. There may be some other reason for that. I mentioned like a stereotype, like example in the chat. I mentioned, and one day, for instance, the U.S. government, if they like ban any CSR reporting, I'm joking here. I mean, prior finding was useless. We should move on to other stuff. So basically, like as long as we can communicate our findings, research, sort of like in a reasonably credible way, a reasonably useful way. I mean, that's good enough. We are researchers. We do what we can. But if the research question is at this point is not that important, maybe we just move on to more important stuff. Those are some thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I'm not exactly sure I totally followed it. I definitely agree that honesty is the critical thing. So one problem that we often have when we report a signal model is that we make claims, we argue, right, that the only uncertainty remaining is that sample uncertainty, when that's not true. And we make broad, strong claims when often we aren't able to do it. So that's honest, that's dishonest, or we're not confident actually to say it. I'm not as convinced that we know very much from management research. I would struggle to tell you much that we've learned. In fact, if anyone wants to come forward with something that we know from management research, I'd be intrigued.
Thank you for I don't know to take too much time. So my point is probably the question itself, CSR firm performance is not that important, because we know we cannot find one single conclusive answer.
But Kay,
for instance, all the samples mostly are FT50 in the US. How does the finding help with people in Africa? I mean, what if the US government policy has changed? I mean, the firm, they're doing that stuff. That's my point. A little bit, for instance, go ahead.
I have to disagree with you strongly.
Okay.
So, supposedly $30 trillion or more are invested in assets that claim to be using ESG ratings in selecting of their stocks.
Yeah.
There's a work being done in Europe and in the United States to change the way firms will report, so that that will be done in supposedly a better way. There are claims, including by Larry Frank, who's the head of Goldman Sachs. Is he the head of Goldman Sachs? Oh my God, I'm having a senior moment. That claims that we aren't going to need government regulation because firms are going to solve these problems voluntarily.
Yeah.
That is, a lot of that stuff is driven by academic research. Academic research has had a very big impact. And I think much of that academic research is not justified. So I don't think this is an unimportant area. I think this is one of the most important areas that I've ever been involved in my career.
I agree with you on that. Thank you, Andrew, for this.
Okay.
My
So
point
I'm gonna move on to David at this point.
Okay.
Sorry.
I see David. Hi, David.
Let me unmute myself. Just thank Kay for contributing. Larry Fink, BlackRock, of saying similar.
Oh, BlackRock. Thank you.
That's Kay Lalasides in the chat function. Thanks for this great talk, Andy, and the lively chat and questions from everyone. I was just sort of wondering about the nature of abduction, and I'm certainly intrigued by it. And I remember when I was a young undergraduate studying statistics for the first time, we looked at exploratory data analysis and used Tukey's book and did all sorts of cluster analysis and factor analysis and things like that to look for patterns in the data. And then, I went to, became a PhD and, learned about model testing and looking for getting significant results. And then, of course, conforming to the hourglass model, more or less, even though I didn't know it was called the hourglass model when I was doing it. And then, of course, along came harking and p-hacking more recently. And now we have abducting from data. So I was kind of wondering, when is p-hacking and harking, and what is abduction? And what is the difference between that? And maybe you have some thoughts on that, or maybe you have some, things you may have thought about it, or references you thought about that. Or maybe it's in your Tim Simcoe's paper.
No,
because it almost seems like when we're abducting, we're almost going back to p-hacking.
We are p-hacking. So abduction. So the thing about frequentist analysis is, remember I said at the beginning, it's the probability of the data conditional on the recipe. The only way it can be conditional on the recipe if the recipe is perfectly fixed in advance. That is, exactly the hypotheses, exactly how you're going to measure all the variables, exactly how you're going to do your sampling, all of that, which we never do, almost never do, very rarely. Usually, and this is what James Heckman writes in Abducting Economics, is we go look at the data. Now, once we've looked at the data, we've added a stochastic element into the way we're forming our recipe. How do the eggs look, whatever. And that's changing then anything that we can say. And if you wanted to put our problem right now in a nutshell, is we engage in abduction and then we lie and say we engaged in a frequentist test. And I've done it. I'm a doper. So one thing that Brent Goldfarb is all over is just be honest. You're always abducting. Now, I'm unsatisfied with that, because at some point, to know anything, we've got to test stuff. So, but even when we're testing stuff, often we have all these uncertainties. And if we sow just one way through the path, we're not going to really be able to understand that test. And so what I'm saying is just acknowledge there's uncertainties when you're doing the test and provide all that information honestly to the reader. And that opens up the aperture of the hourglass and makes it more like a vase. And that, I think, is going to be something that we need to do. Does that make sense? Okay. John.
So I put a quick comment in the chat, basically saying that if AI models learn from the totality of models run, such as what you're showing on the screen here, and management journals in our field only learns from the red dots, we're going to be out of business if we don't make what you're making. And so my question is, why aren't you pushing harder for scholars to submit their articles with this kind of analysis that you're showing on the screen right now? Is it just because of the experience before, or okay?
No, I'm definitely pushing for that. I think, and definitely you can. So if you think about what a lot of AI studies do, is there are two parts. They're an abducted part, where you take the AI and you throw it at a bunch of data and it trains a model. Then you hold that model fixed and you test it out of sample. That's what AI does, right?
Yeah,
or much AI research does. So our problem is we often combine those two steps. And and also we have the problem that we very rarely have a perfectly specified model we can work from. I can tell you when I try to replicate research, even when it's very well described, there's a zillion gaps in it and you have to guess. So we never go from a case where someone has abducted perfectly so that we can perfectly test, because we're not the same people. We're reading it in a report. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think we have to display that uncertainty. Jason.
Thank you for bringing up some of these questions here. My question is having to do with the bottom half of the hourglass.
Of the hourglass.
What would you suggest as we write, future textbooks? What would you, is there a certain, I don't know, format that we should be thinking of? What would be some of the ways that we could maybe fix some of those things that have gone on in that top half of the hourglass? How do we end up talking about like ESG in our textbooks and ways that we are disseminating this to students and even right in the classroom? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason. You just asked me an incredibly difficult question. So here is what happens in the bottom of the hourglass. And this is according to DJ Bem, is that you convert from the probability of the data condition on the model, a frequentist claim, to a belief type claim. That is something that a Bayesian would understand, the probability of your theory conditional on your data. If you think about it, we always do that. We go to the middle and we say, this thing is statistically significant at 0.05. I think I have it in my paper here somewhere. Let me see if I can pull it up quickly. We use different kinds of claims. So we have these kinds of claims in the work that we do usually. I don't know if you guys can see that. But like, imagine you flipped a coin. From a frequentist point of view, you say, based on past flips, this is what this coin is going to do in the future. If you convert to a different kind of way of thinking, you can then say, I think this coin is biased. The first one is about what happens in the future. The second one is about the explanation. Another example is, if we give a treatment to a surgery to some people, what happens to their survival? And then the belief statement is the surgery is extending life. We also see that in our research. Here's an example from Simon Lee. Environmental groups had a significant impact on environmental activity. That's just the coefficient. And then notice now it's become a claim about how the world works. And in the bottom of the hourglass, Bem advises this. He says, go from these narrow statements to grand, he calls them grand, nearly cosmic claims. Well, that's marvelous from a storytelling point of view, because we all like to end with, I've now found the solution to the world. And it makes your paper interesting. And he, in fact, Bem says, don't call for more research, that's boring. But of course, honestly, generally, that's what we have to do. The truth of the matter is we don't really know very much from any particular study. And you bringing up a real tension here, which is, if we're honest, we're going to end every study by saying, oh, it could be this, we need more research. But if we want to sell it, we're going to say we've solved the world's problems. And I don't know how to solve that problem. I can just tell you one little story here. DJ Bem himself got himself into terrible trouble years later when he abducted his way into believing that precognition was possible. That is, he ran a bunch of studies, messed around with the models, and showed that you could predict the future. You getting it? He thought that you had extrasensual perfection about the future. Then published that, and everybody pointed out exactly what he'd done. So he didn't understand these concepts. And there's many examples. The guy at Cornell, Brian Wansink, who confused all this, and he thought from every little tiny thing that little piece of correlation he found, he could make these grand claims. He eventually had to quit. I don't know how to answer your question. I don't know how to widen the thing enough to make it exciting, but still be honest.
Sounds like we have some work to do, right?
We have some work to do.
Thank you.
If you notice, when I draw my hourglass, I draw it narrower at the base, my vase. Anyone else?
Andy, whilst you are on the slide on the vase, there was a question in the chat from David. If you could elaborate on the vase, please. Kind of talk a bit more about it.
The vase?
Yeah.
Just how it works?
Yeah.
So if many of you have the vase. So in the vase, I think the main thing about the vase, think about the vase as an hourglass where you've taken the pinprick opening at the middle and you've widened it out. You've now admitted, hey, there's not just one model that might be right. There's 100. And so then once you've done that, though, it changes everything. And it gets also to the question I just had, which is, well, when you have to analyze across 100 models, you can't use frequentist statistics anymore. You have to use like likelihood ratios or something like that to compare them. So in the middle of the vase, we're not just going to have one table anymore. We're going to have, graphs like I showed you. We might do Bayesian model selection. And we're going to have to do much more discussions of the limitations of the analysis that we have. And so, I'm saying, there's also uncertainty of the need to control. Taking these factors are Occam's window. So some people talk about this aperture now as Occam's window. It's the window of models that you look through to understand the world rather than the pinprick. But now you have to explore and discuss a window of models rather than a single estimate, which means you have to fatten out that middle of your report. Does that make sense? I seem to have lost
Yeah, I think so. This is normal. Whilst you're talking about Occam's window, there's also the notion of Occam's razor.
Yes.
Which encourages us to kind of simplify things. And I wonder I just wonder what you make of Occam's razor in terms of whether that also creates issue in the way we theorize and build our models because we try to make them simple.
Yeah, well, so Occam's window is maybe not the best term. I didn't invent it. It's what the model selection, model averaging people are doing. So I'm describing work that is happening now in political science and other areas where they have this uncertainty about how do we model the world? How should I think about the effect of the death penalty? How should I think about the effect of concealed carry handguns? How should I think? I don't know. So they make more broader analysis. That's where Occam's window comes from. Occam's razor, this idea that when we don't know anything, when we have many options, the simplest explanation is probably the best. That's if I remember correctly what Occam's razor is about. Is what's one of these things called the epistemic virtues that are used in abduction. So what happens is, if you think you're Sherlock Holmes was he participated in abduction. He would go around, he'd find clues, and then he would say, here's my theory. And the best explanation is the simplest one usually. That's a guidance for forming explanations of data that you've already observed, which is abduction. So they're quite different. I wish maybe we shouldn't even use the term here. And of course, Occam himself, the monk, was not around when Occam's window was invented. So it's quite different. Sorry, if that's clear. Any other questions? Any feedback? Advice for how to make this more practical, clearer, anything like that?
If I may, Andy, so maybe since you talk about the reader, maybe it's helpful to like tell the reader like a bit more about what the philosophy of knowledge, how we researchers see as knowledge. Because mostly like readers, like students, they take what we said as truth, but what we said sometimes we know it's not truth. I think that's a kind of important part.
Okay, that's a marvelous observation. That's what I stripped out of my presentation today.
Okay.
I was going to start with this problem of induction, which is all, what David Hume said is all empirical research requires assumptions. And so we can never know from data. And what the response to that was 3 responses. One were the Bayesians. Those are followers of Thomas Bayes. And they basically said, you're right, we can never know, but we can approach truth efficiently. That's what the Bayesians want to do. We'll never know, but we can get there rational. The frequentists, and this is what we do, and I find it totally bizarre in a way of ways. They say, you're right, but it doesn't matter. We don't even know the truth of the theory. We don't really, when we do most of our research, test theory. We just need to predict how data will look if events are repeated. That is the basic epistemological idea of frequentist statistics. We don't need to know why. We just need to know if we water the corner of the south lawn, the corn grows long. And if we keep watering it, it tends to grow higher. That's all we're doing. And there are problems with that, like how do we learn and move across contexts and so forth. The falsifications of which is, Karl Popper, they basically say, you're right, David, we can never know, but we can falsify. So we can separate false truth theories from those that are not yet false. And weirdly, mostly because it's easier, we use this middle group. And then in the bottom half of the hourglass, we flip around and start sounding like Bayesians.
Sounds good.
Okay, I agree with you. This is in my paper, which I'll post on SSRN.
Very quickly, another point is theory can be sort of a performative. Theory is reflective of the reality, but also can be driving force for reality. Coming back to CSR, earlier we discussed about whether research is important or not. I totally agree. We have to do CSR, but we have to let them know, sometimes as a researcher, we have to argue for the case of CSR for sure. And this case is a sort of process. So it's too much. Maybe you can do at other cases. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't really this is the way I think about the world on this screen. I think we can't know. David Hume's right. We can either try to rationally approach knowledge, that is by thinking, what basically Bayesians do is say, what's the probability of this explanation relative to all other possible explanations? That seems reasonable to me. The frequentists say, don't worry about it. Just know whether people get better when you administer the drug. You don't have to know that the drug really causes it. You don't really have to know the explanation. All you really need to know is this is connected to that. That makes sense to me too for practical things. And Popper says, hey, just show that it's false. And gradually by falsifying things, we'll have a set of things that are not yet false, that are probably useful. This is pretty close to the way I think about the world.
Sounds good.
I've gradually driven everyone away. I have 5 minutes. If anyone has a final question or accusation, I'm open to either. Ritus, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes, Andrew, you are an exception. Mostly I'm Ritus, but yes, it is Ritus. You are very correct here. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, my PhD is qualitative, so it's all about argumentation and persuasiveness. So I was wondering, maybe the way out of some problems would be the persuasiveness of arguments, the way you structure the argument rather than the data, because sometimes I read quantitative papers and they make perfect sense and they're very interesting. And I base my work, although it's qualitative, on quantitative research because it's on small business growth. So I was wondering, it's more of a comment, but I think that persuasiveness would be the way out of quite a few problems here.
Well, I'm going to post online, or Ebrat can send it to you, a paper that I've written on the Mann Gulch disaster. Rightus, you surely know the Mann Gulch disaster story, and Carl Weber's Wyke, thank you, explanation of the Mann Gulch disaster. And it's an abducted study, it's a qualitative study, and he's trying to understand why these people died when they were out to firefight in Montana. And it's in the 50s. And what I try to explain in the paper that I will post is, and this is well known, in abduction or influence to this best explanation, we often compare likely and lovely. So you can imagine that there's a story may fit the facts really well, but not seem that interesting or persuasive or exciting. And you could tell the story of these people dying in the canyon as, bad things happened and the fire overtook them and they died. Well, that's probably true. But it's not very interesting or lovely. What you want to do is you want to find something which seems fruitful, useful in the future. Like if they'd only done this, and in this case, it's whether they dropped their tools or not, they would have survived. So we always have this tension between likely and lovely. I think we have that in qualitative research. I think we have it in quantitative research. I do not think qualitative research is at all immune from this. I think there's a tendency to go for the lovely explanation, the one that seems exciting, feels good, hits us as right, truthy, and it's a danger. And that truthiness can also be both on the researcher side and the reader side. I think one of the problems we have with, say, ESG or corporate social responsibility is people love the idea that corporations are going to save them from the planet's disaster. And so it's very convincing. Holly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
By the way, I used abductive reasoning in my research, so I know what you're talking about.
Holly, thank you.
So thank you for the talk. I've learned a lot as we've been talking, and also just kind of concerned, do we still sort of keep centering around the idea that there will be this single truth that is knowable at any given time, as opposed to knowledge really unfolding over time? And so that what we know about CSR cannot be known in 1 or 2 or even 5 papers in this period of time, but will be known, more will be known over time. I'm just thinking about like research on germs, for example, and how people thought about germs at one time. And then as we got more powerful tools, we can understand them differently. We can understand how things are transmitted differently. So I think that's my question is, how do we think about this as a community enterprise? No one paper does it, and a process that unfolds over time.
Okay, well, you had to be a community. So what you said is, I mean, this is the problem with a lot of this stuff is it's extremely deep, and you've touched on some super deep elements of this just there with that. First of all, it is a community enterprise. That's kind of, if you want to take one thing away from this today, is we're only going to learn if we can read and trust each other. And we're only going to be able to read and trust each other if we change the way we report. That's number one. Number two, Holly, you brought up this idea that the world is constantly changing. And so we may never be able to know anything because the world could change, which was one of the objections that David Hume had. He said, you can do these experiments, but then you only know if you assume tomorrow's like today. Maybe it isn't, which, that's a big problem. To me, I'm okay with that because I feel like I'm just going to study within the world that we have, now, and I can trust about the future. And then you said another thing, which is so deep, it's unbelievable, which is I struggled with this. And okay, so it's that you don't know how to interpret the data unless you have plausible ways of thinking about the data in your head.
Right.
And this is a huge problem for Bayesians, and it's called the problem of old knowledge, which is Bayesians think data comes along and you use it rationally to get smarter. Yeah, no, because the problem comes along, you don't know how to think about it. And it sits there for a long time until you learn about how to make the interpretation in the future, which they cannot answer. So it is still a bit of a puzzle about how we should work through this problem of old knowledge. So, Holly,
Well,
I'm with you. I don't have answers, though.
One other thought is not just that the world would change, but I think it's that last thing that you just said, that the world isn't changing at all, right? Germs always existed. They always caused disease. We didn't know that germs existed because we couldn't see them. So we had no way to think about that. And when people started to suggest it, we thought they were being ridiculous, that there could be something invisible that could cause disease. So it's not just that the world is changing, but we just need to be able to think about the world differently. And we can't, because we don't have the technology, we don't have the right ways of looking at things. And so.
Yeah, so Clark Glymour is your guy, and he, your observation is extremely insightful. And he struggled in the wilderness for many years, running around saying, we have this problem in Bayesian reasoning. And finally, people began to pay attention. So I totally agree with you. And it's probably, very interesting. Anything else? Okay, Ibra, do you want
conscious? Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
No.
I'm just being conscious of time as we're coming towards the end of the 90 minutes we're allocated for the conversation. But do you have any maybe concluding remarks for the new researchers? And this relates to Sumera's comment in the chat. How do we learn by believing and reading the current research to begin with? She's asking, do you have any suggestions for new researchers?
Well, when reading, I don't know. So the problem with giving suggestions, I understand that I'm old, and so I've been around for a long period of time, but I followed one particular path through my life. So I can generalize from my own private experience, but it could be wrong. Somebody else's experience would be different. But I can tell you what I do. When I read a paper, I do not trust that it's right. I generally think, yeah, there might be something in here. And I try to really evaluate whether I think it's both competent, that is, they can make the claims that they're claiming, and it's sincere. Like they're giving me the middle of what they think, not just some biased or extreme part of it. And to do that, you really often have to look carefully at the data. And a lot of times papers are broken in visible form. One of the most cited papers in ASQ compares two coefficients and concludes that the smaller one is larger than the bigger one because the smaller one is significant and the larger one is not. So, sometimes these problems are right there. So think critically, read carefully, be skeptical, think about model uncertainty, and file it away as, yeah, it could be right. I don't like it when people say, we know this, please never say, we know this from King and Lennox, or King and Lennox have shown, or that. You can say, evidence, reported by King and Lennox suggests, or something, but be careful. And then when you're writing, I find that writing is often, we should think about the reader, and we should think about our own moral responsibilities. I often ask my question, you know, because we're often trying to find the interesting thing, we're trying to report the interesting thing, but that gets pretty close to lying. Like, so you constantly have to say to yourself, am I reporting the middle of what I think, or am I reporting the more interesting thing that I can report here? So think about your reader and always ask yourself, am I being as honest with the reader as I can be? That's my advice. Whether it gets you ahead in your career, I cannot say.